um, I just got a phone call, and it was like, I think it was like that for everyone. It was just so horrific. You couldn't take it in, and I couldn't take it in.
Picture this. You're Paul McCartney, one of the most famous musicians in history. You've just written what you think is one of your most beautiful songs ever. Simple, emotional, and comes straight from your heart. Then one day, someone takes that precious song and completely destroys it without even asking you. They add orchestras, choirs, and horns that you never wanted. Your masterpiece becomes something you can barely recognize. How would you feel? Absolutely furious, right? Well, that's exactly what happened to Paul McCartney, and it created the most bitter hatred he ever felt toward another person. Today, we're diving deep into the story of Paul McCartney's greatest enemy. This isn't about John Lennon or George Harrison or even Ringo Starr, though those relationships had their rocky moments too. No, this is about someone who wasn't even a member of the Beatles but managed to hurt Paul so deeply that the wounds lasted for decades. This is the story of Paul McCartney versus Phil Spector. And trust me, it's more dramatic than any soap opera you've ever watched. To understand why Paul McCartney developed such intense hatred for Phil Spector, we need to go back to the very end of the Beatles. By 1969, the greatest band in the world was falling apart. The four lads from Liverpool who had conquered the world were now barely speaking to each other. John Lennon was getting deeper into his relationship with Yoko Ono, and the other Beatles felt like she was driving a wedge between them. George Harrison was tired of being treated like the little brother and wanted more respect for his songwriting. Even Ringo Starr was feeling left out and frustrated. But Paul McCartney was trying his hardest to keep the band together. He truly believed they could work through their problems and continue making beautiful music. Paul was the one pushing for new projects, trying to get everyone excited about being Beatles again. One of these projects was supposed to be a simple idea. They would go back to their roots, strip away all the fancy studio tricks they had been using, and just play music like they did in the early days. They called this the Get Back Project. The plan was straightforward. The Beatles would rehearse some songs, play them live, and record an album that captured their raw, honest sound. No overdubs, no studio magic. Just four friends playing music together like they used to do in the little clubs in Hamburg and Liverpool. Paul thought this would remind everyone why they loved making music in the first place. It seemed like the perfect way to heal the wounds that were tearing the band apart. But things didn't go according to Paul's plan. The Get Back sessions were tense and uncomfortable. John seemed more interested in Yoko than in the music. George and Paul got into heated arguments about songs and arrangements. The atmosphere was so bad that George actually quit the band for a few days before coming back. Even when they managed to put on that famous rooftop concert at their Apple building, you could feel the tension beneath the smiles. After all the drama, they ended up with hours and hours of recordings from these sessions. Some of it was great, some of it was okay, and some of it was pretty rough. The Beatles tried several times to turn these recordings into a proper album, but they just couldn't agree on how to do it. Every time someone tried to mix and arrange the songs, the others would complain or reject it entirely. The project sat on the shelf for months, gathering dust while the Beatles continued to drift apart. Then, in early 1970, something happened that would change everything and create Paul McCartney's greatest enemy. John Lennon made a decision without consulting Paul or really getting proper approval from the other Beatles. He brought in Phil Spector to take over the Get Back project and turn it into a finished album. Now you might be wondering, who exactly was Phil Spector? Well, Phil Spector was one of the most successful music producers of the 1960s. He was famous for creating what he called the wall of sound. This was a production technique where he would layer dozens and dozens of instruments on top of each other to create this massive, overwhelming sound. Think of songs like Be My Baby by the Ronettes or You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin' by the Righteous Brothers. Those huge, dramatic productions were Phil Spector's specialty. Phil Spector was brilliant at what he did, but he was also known for being difficult to work with. He was controlling, demanding, and had very strong opinions about how music should sound. He wasn't the kind of person who would ask for your permission before making changes. If Phil Spector was producing your song, it was going to sound the way Phil Spector wanted it to sound, whether you liked it or not. So when John Lennon brought Phil Spector in to work on the Get Back tapes, it was like asking a bull to organize a china shop. The whole point of the Get Back project had been to strip things down and keep them simple. But Phil Spector's approach was the complete opposite. He believed in making everything bigger, louder, and more dramatic. Paul McCartney wasn't happy about Phil Spector being brought in, but at this point, he was exhausted from fighting. The Beatles were basically broken up already, even if they hadn't announced it yet. Paul figured maybe it was better to let someone else deal with the tapes and try to salvage something from all those hours of recordings. He had no idea what Phil Spector was planning to do to his songs. Phil Spector got to work on the tapes, and he immediately started applying his wall of sound technique to the Beatles' recordings. He added orchestras to songs that were meant to be simple. He brought in choirs to sing along with songs that were supposed to be intimate. He layered on strings and horns and all kinds of instruments that the Beatles had never intended to be there. But the worst was yet to come. Paul McCartney had written a song called The Long and Winding Road. This was one of Paul's most personal and emotional songs ever. It was inspired by his feelings about the Beatles breaking up and the sadness he felt about losing his best friends and creative partners. The song was meant to be simple and melancholy, just Paul's voice and piano with maybe a little bit of bass and drums. It was supposed to feel like a lonely, heartbroken ballad. When Paul first recorded The Long and Winding Road during the Get Back sessions, it was exactly what he had envisioned. It was raw, emotional, and beautiful in its simplicity. The pain in Paul's voice was clear, and the sparse arrangement made every word and every note feel more powerful. It was the kind of song that could make you cry just from hearing the emotion in Paul's performance. But Phil Spector had very different ideas about how The Long and Winding Road should sound. Without asking Paul for permission, without even telling him what he was planning to do, Phil Spector took Paul's intimate ballad and turned it into something completely different. He added a full orchestra with sweeping strings. He brought in a women's choir to sing along with certain parts. He layered on horns and harps and all kinds of orchestral instruments. When Phil Spector was finished with The Long and Winding Road, it sounded nothing like the song Paul McCartney had written and recorded. Instead of a simple, heartbroken ballad, it had become this big, dramatic, overproduced piece that sounded more like a movie soundtrack than a Beatles song. The raw emotion that had made the original recording so powerful was buried under layers and layers of orchestral arrangements. The first time Paul McCartney heard what Phil Spector had done to The Long and Winding Road, he was absolutely devastated. This wasn't just about music for Paul. This was about respect, creativity, and artistic integrity. Someone had taken one of his most personal songs and completely changed it without even asking him. It was like someone had taken a painting you had created and painted over it with their own vision. Paul was so angry and hurt that he immediately wrote a furious letter to Apple Records, the Beatles' record company. In this letter, Paul made it very clear that he was absolutely not okay with what Phil Spector had done to his song. He said that the orchestral arrangements were completely against his wishes and that he would never have approved adding female voices to a Beatles record. Paul felt that Phil Spector had completely ruined one of his best songs. But Phil Spector wasn't interested in Paul's complaints. In fact, Phil Spector seemed to think that Paul should be grateful for what he had done. Phil believed that his arrangements had made The Long and Winding Road better, not worse. He thought Paul was being ungrateful and didn't understand how much Phil's production work had improved the song. This attitude made Paul even angrier. It wasn't just that Phil Spector had changed his song without permission. It was that Phil Spector didn't even seem to understand why Paul was upset. Phil acted like he had done Paul a favor, like he had taken a rough diamond and polished it into something beautiful. But Paul saw it the complete opposite way. To Paul, Phil Spector had taken a beautiful, perfect song and ruined it with unnecessary additions. The conflict over The Long and Winding Road became one of the final straws that led to the official breakup of the Beatles. Paul was so angry about what had happened to his song that he decided he couldn't work with the other Beatles anymore if this was how his music was going to be treated. The lack of respect shown to his artistic vision was something Paul simply couldn't forgive or forget. When the album that became known as Let It Be was finally released in May 1970, it included Phil Spector's version of The Long and Winding Road, with all the orchestral arrangements that Paul hated. For Paul, hearing that version of his song on the radio and seeing it in record stores was like a constant reminder of how his artistic vision had been disrespected and ignored. But the story doesn't end there. Paul McCartney's hatred for Phil Spector continued to grow over the years. Every time someone praised Phil Spector's work on Let It Be, Paul felt a stab of anger and frustration. Every time he heard that orchestrated version of The Long and Winding Road, it reminded him of how powerless he had felt in those final days of the Beatles. Phil Spector, for his part, never seemed to understand why Paul was so upset. In interviews over the years, Phil would often defend his work on the Beatles album and suggest that Paul was being difficult and unreasonable. Phil would claim that the original recordings were rough and unfinished, and that his orchestral arrangements had made them into proper, professional-sounding songs. This attitude only made Paul hate him more. The feud between Paul McCartney and Phil Spector lasted for decades. Unlike Paul's conflicts with John Lennon, which were eventually resolved before John's tragic death in 1980, the hatred between Paul and Phil never really went away. Paul continued to speak negatively about Phil Spector in interviews, and Phil continued to defend his work and criticize Paul's attitude. Years later, when Paul got the opportunity to release a version of Let It Be without Phil Spector's orchestral additions, he jumped at the chance. The album Let It Be Naked was released in 2003, and it presented the Beatles' final album the way Paul had always wanted it to sound. The Long and Winding Road appeared on this album in a stripped-down version that was much closer to Paul's original vision. For Paul, this was a chance to finally present his song the way he had always intended it to be heard. The difference between Phil Spector's version and Paul's preferred version of The Long and Winding Road is like night and day. Phil's version is big and dramatic and orchestral. Paul's preferred version is simple, intimate, and emotional. Both versions have their supporters, but for Paul, only one version represents his true artistic vision. What made this feud so intense wasn't just about one song, though. It was about respect, creativity, and the right of an artist to control their own work. Paul McCartney had spent years building the Beatles into the greatest band in the world, and he felt that Phil Spector had disrespected all of that hard work by changing his songs without permission. For someone as proud and perfectionist as Paul, this kind of disrespect was absolutely unforgivable. Phil Spector's later life was marked by increasingly strange and disturbing behavior. He became known for being difficult to work with and eventually became a recluse, rarely leaving his mansion in California. In 2003, Phil Spector was arrested for the murder of actress Lana Clarkson, and he was eventually convicted and sentenced to prison, where he died in 2021. But even Phil Spector's legal troubles and death didn't seem to soften Paul McCartney's feelings about what had happened to The Long and Winding Road all those years ago. The story of Paul McCartney's hatred for Phil Spector teaches us something important about art and creativity. When you create something, whether it's a song or a painting or a poem or anything else, it's deeply personal. Comes from inside you, from your experiences and emotions and vision. When someone else changes your creation without your permission, it can feel like they're attacking not just your work, but you as a person. Paul McCartney was famous for being one of the most collaborative musicians in history. He worked beautifully with John Lennon for years, trading ideas and building on each other's creativity. He was happy to take suggestions and make changes when they improved a song. But what Phil Spector did was different. Phil didn't collaborate with Paul or ask for his input. Phil simply took Paul's song and made it into something completely different, something that Paul felt was inferior to his original vision. This is why Paul's hatred for Phil Spector was so much more intense than his conflicts with other people. With John Lennon, even during their worst fights, there was still love and respect underneath the anger. Paul knew that John cared about the music and wanted to make it as good as possible, even when they disagreed about how to do that. But with Phil Spector, Paul felt that there was no respect for his artistic vision at all. The Phil Spector situation also shows us how the breakup of the Beatles was about more than just personal conflicts between the band members. It was also about losing control over their music and their legacy. When Phil Spector was brought in to work on their final album, it represented everything that had gone wrong with the Beatles. They were no longer four friends working together to create music. Instead, outsiders were making decisions about their songs without their input or approval. For Paul McCartney, who had always been deeply invested in every aspect of the Beatles' music, this loss of control was devastating. He had spent years perfecting his craft, learning how to write better songs and make better recordings. To have someone else come in and change his work without permission felt like all of that effort and expertise was being dismissed and ignored. Today, more than 50 years after the release of Let It Be, the conflict between Paul McCartney and Phil Spector is still remembered as one of the most bitter feuds in music history. It's a reminder that art is personal, that creativity requires respect, and that some wounds never fully heal. Paul McCartney went on to have an incredibly successful solo career and later formed Wings, one of the most successful bands of the 1970s. He continued to write beautiful, simple songs that showcased his incredible talent for melody and emotion. But he never forgot what Phil Spector did to The Long and Winding Road, and he never forgave the disrespect that was shown to his artistic vision during those final, painful days of the Beatles. The next time you listen to The Long and Winding Road, whether it's Phil Spector's orchestral version or Paul's preferred stripped-down version, remember this story. Remember that behind every song is an artist who poured their heart and soul into creating something beautiful. And that respect for that creativity is one of the most important things we can offer to the artists who give us music. Phil Spector may have been a talented producer, but his treatment of Paul McCartney's music created a hatred that lasted a lifetime. It's a powerful reminder that talent alone isn't enough. Respect, collaboration, and understanding are just as important as technical skill when it comes to creating great art. And that's the story of Paul McCartney's greatest enemy. Not John Lennon, not George Harrison, not any of the other Beatles, but Phil Spector, the man who took one of Paul's most beautiful songs and changed it forever without even asking permission. It's a story about art, respect, and the pain that comes when someone you trust betrays your creative vision. If you enjoyed learning about this fascinating and dramatic piece of Beatles history, make sure to hit that like button and let me know in the comments which Beatles story you'd like to hear about next. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the most incredible stories from music history. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.